Joining us now, Jay Robertson, fellow on criminal justice reform for Empower Mississippi. Jay, good to see you.
Hey, Gerard. How are you today?
Doing great. So wanted to have you on to talk about this recent report from the Department of Justice concerning Parchman here in the state of Mississippi. Sounds like there are some problems revealed in the report that Parchman has got to grapple with. What does this mean for the state? And first, I guess, Jay, tell us a little bit about the problems that the DOJ is calling attention to and what this means.
Absolutely. Well, Gerard, this probably doesn't come as any surprise to you or most of the people listening that Parchman is not a great place to be and has a lot of problems. And I think that no one expects prison to be a great place, but we have a really special circumstance here in Parchman where Mississippi is just not even in a position to provide basic constitutional protections and provide for public safety, not just for the people incarcerated, but correctional officers and guards. And it's created a really dangerous situation, which impacts not just Parchman itself, but public safety outside the prison walls. And so that's what this report really dug into. And I think it's easy for us to forget that, what happens in prison only affects people in prison. But as you've been talking about, all the crime that we see in cities and public safety issues we see outside are directly related lots of times to the conditions in our prisons and inside the criminal justice system. And so that's the reason this report is really timely, and it's important for us to take a look at the findings of the report and exactly what we can do to try and correct this situation to create a better environment for safety in the state.
So what's the genesis of the DOJ getting involved, launching an investigation, and then producing a report like this? Is this because someone has complained? Has there been a lawsuit? Has there just been information leaking from the incarcerated or their families? How does this come about?
Well, for the past several years, there have been numerous reports of extreme violence and awful conditions inside Parchman and other prisons around the state. And so we'd heard this from years for people who had family members incarcerated, information that was getting out. And a lot of that came to really a boiling point in December of 2019. And you might recall there was a riot that started at Parchman, a few fights that developed into a riot that lasted for weeks, where the Department of Corrections had no control over the situation. They had to call in local sheriffs as well as Mississippi Highway Patrol to just regain control of the prison. It was taken over by gangs, and there have been multiple instances of deaths, suicides, and all of that came to a head, generated national attention, and that's what sparked this investigation. And so this investigation actually started in 2020 under the Trump administration. And so this is not a partisan issue that's, the Biden administration coming after Mississippi. This is something that started in a Republican administration to investigate these problems, because once again, it's not just a matter of the constitutional issues for people incarcerated, which is the really basis for the report, but then also how that impacts public safety inside and outside the prison walls. So that was the genesis, and that led to the DOJ spending just over 2 years investigating all these instances and putting together this report that was just issued 2 weeks ago that really dives into a lot of the issues and how those can be addressed by the state.
So the DOJ just has the authority? Are there certain criteria, I guess, for them to have the ability to? I'm assuming that they did physical investigations, right, on site, the DOJ, or dispatch someone on their behalf to do so.
It's a good question. There's federal legislation that gives the Department of Justice oversight into state prisons to basically investigate issues of constitutional abuses. So the legal analysis here turns on a couple of issues. The main one is the Eighth Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment, and then the right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And so there are lots of legal precedents that have been developed over the years to determine what really is cruel and unusual punishment, and where do you draw the line from just what people expect prison to be, which is not a pleasant or violence-free place, but where do you cross the line where it is so unpleasant, it is undermining just basic human decency and creating such a violent situation that it really crosses the line into cruel and unusual punishment. So the Department of Justice has authority to look at that.
I was just going to share for our audience a couple of the findings, failing to provide adequate mental health treatment to people with serious mental health needs, failing to take sufficient suicide prevention measures to protect people at risk or self-harm, subjecting people to prolonged isolation and solitary confinement in egregious conditions that place their physical and mental health at substantial risk of serious harm, failing to protect incarcerated people from violence at the hands of other incarcerated people. I think that pretty much summarizes it. So then, Jay, I guess what that obviously would mean that you're violating certain constitutional rights for failing to meet some of those protections, provide some of those protections, et cetera. And I guess they found that at Parchman's the bottom line.
That's right, Gerard. And when you really dive into the examples here, so DOJ spent years going through all these reports. It's 60 pages of examples of each of those things. And it reads like a horror novel. I mean, when you dig into what extreme conditions look like, it's people living with raw sewage on the floor in temperatures in excess of 120 degrees in Mississippi summers, people who are threatening suicide and basically giving no attention and then completing suicide, rampant contraband, weapons, guards being attacked with no investigation and no recourse. You have instances where people are subject to violence, are stabbed, and you actually have inmates calling 911 to get the 911 dispatcher to alert MDOC because that's the only way they can get attention. You have instances of one corrections officer supervising over 100 people. So severe understaffing. A lot of times there's no checking in on any people in certain units for up to 12 hours at a time. And so it's a situation where people are subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, yes. But I would argue that even if you don't care about the constitutional grounds here or the way people are treated when they're incarcerated, you should care about the way it impacts public safety. Because what this does, it creates an environment where people leave prison worse than when they went in, and it creates a more dangerous environment for us in the general community as well.
I'm looking at a photo. You've probably seen this one, Jay, and this is clearly these are prisoners that are dressed in the orange and white striped outfits they wear. They're laying out on the floor right next to a full toilet. They're shoulder to shoulder, and that's where they're sleeping. And so this is from the Equal Justice Initiative, and they're calling attention to some of the issues there. So here's the question. It would be easy and convenient to lay this at the feet of our present Commissioner of Corrections, which is Burl Cain. He's been on board, year and a half, couple of years now. This has been going on a long time. I think he's working awfully hard to correct a lot of these issues, and he's talked about those on this program and on this network and in the public in general. But this has been accumulating for a while. At the end of the day, all of our state lawmakers are ultimately responsible.
That's right, and it's not an easy problem that started overnight. It's not one that will be solved overnight. I will say that the report indicates that the State Department of Corrections fully cooperated with federal investigators. And then Mississippi's taken significant steps in just recent years through parole reform and criminal justice reforms to try and decrease the prison population, because there's two parts to this equation. Most of these issues can be attributed to understaffing and lack of resources. Sure, that's what all of it boils down to. For the most part. Well, you got to
think when you see them sleeping on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, not enough room to put them in bedding units.
Sure. So that's part of it too, and some of that has been addressed in that the population in Parchman has decreased about 40% since this report started, and that's the result of an effort from the Department of Corrections to try and redistribute people to facilities that are better suited. But the main issues regarding staffing and lack of supervision, it's a really simple equation. We have a certain number of people in prison and a certain number of correction officers to guard them. According to the report, DOC is understaffed by about 50% right now.
Unbelievable.
Which is huge.
Got a couple of minutes left. So Jay, what's next? What's what's coming up next? Is there a possibility that the DOJ comes in, takes over? Got about a minute left.
Absolutely.
What's going to happen? Yeah.
The report says that the DOJ has the right to file suit against the state in the next 30 days. That could very well be happening. And At that point, the federal government will determine how we fix this. But there's two ways the
Okay.
state can fix it. We can either put more money into it or decrease the number of people we're supervising. Both of that are needed, but there's a smart way to do it in a way that makes us safer, and that's the solutions that we want to support and empower lawmakers to enact through Empower Mississippi.
Absolutely. So sounds like a matter that is urgent. I think that's the point here. Jay, appreciate you coming on. Thanks for all you do in this effort in this area. It's very important to the state, and we need good policy here. Thank you, Jay.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gerard.
We'll be back on midday. Stay with us.